The rarest language in the world is not spoken with words. It is spoken through respect. The dining room of Lucille, one of Manhattan's most exclusive Michelin-starred restaurants, had never felt so unusually quiet. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors, while soft piano music floated through the elegant room. Yet every conversation seemed to fade the moment the front doors opened. Daniel Harrison had arrived. At 40 years old, the billionaire chief executive officer of Harrison Global carried a reputation that reached far beyond the financial world. Investors admired his discipline, competitors respected his judgment, and luxury restaurants across New York quietly feared his attention to detail. Stories about impossible standards followed him everywhere. Some claimed he could recognize the origin of olive oil after a single taste. Others insisted he once noticed a translation mistake hidden inside an international menu that no one else had seen. Whether the stories were completely true no longer mattered. They had become part of the legend surrounding the man. As Daniel removed his tailored charcoal overcoat and handed it to the hostess, an almost invisible wave of anxiety moved through the restaurant staff. One waitress looked away. Another suddenly became busy arranging silverware. A third quietly volunteered to refill water glasses instead of approaching table 12. The restaurant manager understood immediately. No one wanted the responsibility. "I need someone for Mr. Harrison's table," he whispered calmly. Silence answered him. Every server knew that one careless mistake could become an unforgettable memory. Then a gentle voice broke the tension. "I will take care of him." The manager turned toward Claire Bennett. 28 years old, Claire wore the same black and white waitress uniform as everyone else. Yet there was something quietly different about her. Her blonde hair was neatly tied back. Her calm blue eyes reflected confidence rather than nervousness. And even after working a demanding shift, she carried herself with unhurried grace. The manager frowned slightly. "Claire, you know who he is." She smiled. Politely. "Yes. People say he notices everything. Then I will give him something worth noticing." She accepted the leather-bound menu, lifted a polished silver serving tray, and walked steadily across the dining room. Daniel had already opened several business documents beside a glass of sparkling water. He barely acknowledged the movement around him until Claire stopped beside the table. Instead of interrupting, she patiently waited for him to finish reading the final sentence on the page. Only when he naturally looked up did she speak. Her greeting came not in English, but in a remarkably rare Swiss-German mountain dialect spoken by only a small number of families in the Alpine region. "Good evening. I hope your journey from Zurich was peaceful, and I hope this evening offers you a little of the comfort you left behind." Daniel slowly lowered the document in his hand. Surprise replaced his usual reserved expression almost instantly. Without warning, he answered in the same dialect, choosing an old regional phrase that most language professors would struggle to recognize. Claire replied with perfect pronunciation, matching not only his vocabulary, but also the rhythm and warmth of someone who truly understood the culture behind every word. Nearby servers stopped walking. The sommelier paused while uncorking an expensive bottle of wine. Even several guests turned their attention toward table 12 without understanding why the atmosphere had suddenly changed. Daniel switched back to English and studied her carefully. "Where did you learn that dialect?" Claire gently placed the menu before him. "From two elderly guests who visited every Thursday evening for nearly 4 years. They missed home, so I decided their language deserved to feel welcome here." Daniel remained silent for a moment. Most people do not even know it exists. Claire's smile remained soft. Most people have never taken the time to listen for it. Something almost impossible happened. Daniel Harrison smiled. It was small enough that many people would have missed it, but the restaurant manager noticed immediately from across the room. The tension disappeared as though someone had quietly opened a window after a long winter. Daniel closed the menu without reading it. "Tell me what you believe I should order tonight." Claire considered the question only briefly. "Our chef has prepared a seasonal dish inspired by traditional Alpine flavors. It is not printed on the menu because he wanted it to surprise guests who appreciate thoughtful details." Daniel leaned back slightly, no longer evaluating the restaurant, but becoming genuinely curious about the woman standing before him. As Claire walked calmly toward the kitchen to place the order, no one in the dining room realized they had just witnessed the beginning of a conversation that would quietly transform two completely different lives. 8 hours earlier that same morning, Manhattan slowly awakened beneath a pale spring sunrise, while two completely different lives moved toward the same destination without either person realizing it. On the highest floor of Harrison Global Headquarters, Daniel Harrison stood before a wall of glass overlooking the city as ferries crossed the Hudson River below. His schedule had already been planned down to the minute. International conference calls, investment reviews, board meetings, and an evening dinner with Swiss business partners filled every hour. Precision had become the rhythm of his life. Inside the executive conference room, senior leaders prepared detailed presentations while assistants quietly organized reports along the polished walnut table. Daniel listened carefully to every proposal, asking thoughtful questions whenever assumptions replaced evidence. His standards were demanding, but never unfair. He believed every important decision deserved complete attention because thousands of employees depended upon the quality of those choices. Near the end of the morning meeting, one executive confidently announced that everything had been arranged for the evening dinner at Lucille. Professional interpreters would assist the Swiss delegation, customized menus had been prepared, and every logistical detail appeared flawless. Daniel acknowledged the effort with a slight nod before quietly saying, "Successful meetings rarely depend on perfect schedules. They depend on whether people truly understand one another." Several executives exchanged thoughtful glances because they had heard Daniel repeat similar ideas before. Years spent expanding Harrison Global throughout Europe had taught him that trust was often built through seemingly ordinary moments. Correctly pronouncing a family name, recognizing a regional tradition, or respecting a local custom frequently accomplished more than the strongest financial argument. Meanwhile, across the city in a modest apartment above a neighborhood bakery, Claire Bennett finished preparing breakfast for her widowed mother before changing into her restaurant uniform. Warm sunlight entered through the kitchen window while fresh bread baked downstairs filled the apartment with a comforting aroma. Her mother smiled gently while watching Claire place language books back onto a nearby shelf. "Did you stay awake studying again?" she asked. Claire laughed softly. "Only a little longer than I planned." Beside the table rested notebooks filled with handwritten vocabulary, cultural notes, and carefully organized observations collected over many years. Claire had once planned to complete a graduate degree in linguistics, but when her father became seriously ill, she quietly paused her education to help care for her family. She never described the decision as giving something up. She simply believed that love sometimes asked people to choose different paths before returning to old dreams. During her subway ride into Manhattan, Claire listened through small headphones as recordings moved naturally between German, French, Italian, and several uncommon Swiss dialects. She often replayed difficult expressions until every subtle pronunciation felt completely natural. Learning languages had never been about impressing anyone. She simply enjoyed discovering how different cultures expressed kindness, gratitude, humor, and hope. By early afternoon, she arrived at Lucille, where preparations for the evening service had already begun. Crystal glasses reflected warm light, while chefs carefully discussed seasonal ingredients inside the open kitchen. Claire greeted every co-worker by name before helping arrange the dining room with her usual calm efficiency. Later that afternoon, the restaurant manager entered the staff room carrying the reservation list for the evening. His expression immediately became more serious. "Everyone," he said quietly, "Daniel Harrison will be joining us tonight with international guests." A nervous silence filled the room. One waitress admitted she hoped another server would receive the table. Another quietly whispered that the billionaire always noticed the smallest mistakes. Claire folded a linen napkin with steady hands and looked toward the manager. "Every guest deserves the same care," she said gently. The manager smiled with appreciation, though he still sensed the growing tension around the room. Outside, evening slowly settled across Manhattan as city lights reflected against polished windows and elegant cars began arriving beneath the restaurant entrance. Claire adjusted the final place, setting at table 12, before taking one slow breath. She could not have known that within the next few minutes one forgotten mountain dialect, one thoughtful greeting, and one ordinary conversation would begin changing not only an unforgettable dinner, but also the future of two lives that had been quietly moving toward each other all day. The first course arrived with quiet elegance. carried through the softly illuminated dining room as though the evening itself had slowed to watch what would happen next. Claire Bennett placed the porcelain plate before Daniel Harrison with steady hands and an unhurried smile. Delicate alpine trout rested beside roasted spring vegetables, finished with a light herb butter inspired by traditional recipes from the Swiss mountains. Our chef prepared this for guests who appreciate authentic regional flavors, Claire said gently. He hopes it reminds travelers that memories can be served as beautifully as meals. Daniel looked down at the presentation before lifting his eyes toward her again. You understand Swiss cuisine as well? He asked. Claire answered with quiet humility. Only enough to respect the people who created it. Daniel nodded slowly before tasting the first bite. He remained silent for several moments, allowing every flavor to settle before speaking again. Remarkable, he admitted. It reminds me of a small restaurant outside Interlaken that my grandfather loved. Claire smiled softly. Then the chef will be happy. He always says food succeeds only when it brings someone home for a moment. Before Daniel could continue, the restaurant entrance opened once more as three distinguished Swiss executives arrived for the evening meeting. Warm greetings filled the room while the restaurant manager escorted the guests to Daniel's table. Handshakes were exchanged, chairs were pulled back, and business conversations gradually blended into stories about travel, family traditions, and shared professional experiences. Claire quietly poured sparkling water for each guest before stepping back, without interrupting the flow of conversation. At first, everything unfolded exactly as planned. Professional interpreters translated smoothly between English and German while dinner progressed from one course to the next. Then one elderly executive unexpectedly shifted into a rare mountain dialect while describing the history of his family's company. The interpreter paused for only a second, yet that single hesitation changed the atmosphere around the table. She translated the general meaning accurately, but several expressions carried emotional significance that disappeared completely once converted into standard English. The elderly gentleman noticed the missing warmth and politely tried again using different words, yet the subtle cultural meaning remained lost. Daniel listened carefully, recognizing enough of the dialect to realize something important had slipped away, but not enough to restore the conversation himself. Claire, standing quietly several feet away, immediately understood what had happened. She waited respectfully until the speaker finished before asking permission with a gentle smile. May I offer a small clarification? Every face at the table turned toward her. The elderly executive nodded warmly. Claire responded in the same mountain dialect with perfect pronunciation, carefully explaining the traditional expression before translating not only the words, but the feeling behind them. He is describing a family promise, she explained in English. In his village, they believed a handshake should carry the same weight as a written contract because trust was considered the first investment between neighbors. Silence followed her explanation for only a heartbeat before warm smiles spread around the table. The elderly executive laughed with genuine delight and answered Claire in another regional expression. She replied effortlessly, causing the other Swiss guests to smile with obvious admiration. Even the interpreter relaxed, grateful that someone understood the cultural details she had never been expected to learn. Daniel watched the exchange without saying a word. Throughout years of international business, he had met highly educated consultants, diplomats, and professional translators, yet very few people possessed Claire's rare ability to preserve both language and emotion at the same time. As dinner continued, the atmosphere transformed completely. Formal negotiations gradually became authentic conversations. Business partners shared childhood memories, local customs, and family stories that would never have appeared inside a financial presentation. Claire contributed only when invited, always choosing careful words before quietly stepping back so others remained the center of attention. She never attempted to impress anyone. Her confidence came from serving the conversation rather than herself. Near the end of the evening, one of the Swiss executives looked toward Daniel with an appreciative smile. Your choice of restaurant was excellent, he said. But the greatest surprise tonight was not the meal. It was discovering someone who understands our language well enough to understand our hearts. Daniel looked across the dining room toward Claire as she calmly prepared another table for arriving guests. For the first time in many years, The billionaire chief executive officer found himself questioning one assumption that had quietly guided much of his professional life. Perhaps extraordinary talent did not always arrive wearing an expensive suit. Perhaps sometimes it carried a serving tray with quiet dignity. Instead, when the last guest departed and the crystal glasses reflected only the soft glow of closing lights, Daniel Harrison remained seated for several quiet moments instead of asking for his check. The restaurant had returned to its peaceful rhythm. Chairs were carefully aligned. White tablecloths were straightened. Gentle piano music drifted through the nearly empty dining room. Claire Bennett carried a small pot of fresh coffee toward his table with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the evening. "Would you care for one last cup before you leave?" she asked. Daniel smiled politely. "Only if you will allow me to ask one more question." Claire poured the coffee before taking a respectful step back. "Questions are always welcome." Daniel looked toward the rain beginning to fall outside the tall windows. How does someone working in a restaurant learn a dialect that even experienced interpreters rarely hear? Claire folded her hands lightly before answering. "I listened." Daniel waited quietly. Several years ago, an elderly Swiss couple visited every Thursday evening. They always requested the same table by the window. At first they spoke English because they assumed no one would understand them. One evening I recognized a few familiar words and greeted them in German. They laughed kindly and began teaching me a little more each week. Eventually, they shared stories in their mountain dialect because it reminded them of home. Daniel looked genuinely curious. "You studied with them during work?" Claire nodded gently. "Sometimes after my shift. Sometimes before they left. They missed their grandchildren, and I enjoyed learning. It became our Thursday tradition." Daniel lowered his eyes for a thoughtful moment. "You invested years learning a language simply to help two guests feel less lonely." Claire smiled softly. "Languages are memories. When someone speaks the words they grew up hearing, they often smile before they even realize why." Daniel remained silent. He could not remember the last time someone had explained knowledge with such quiet simplicity. Before leaving, he thanked Claire once more and stepped into the cool Manhattan night. But the conversation stayed with him long after the restaurant disappeared behind him. The following morning, Daniel arrived at Harrison Global earlier than usual. Instead of beginning with financial reports, he asked his executive assistant to arrange a brief conversation with the owner of Lucille later that afternoon. There was no desire to investigate Claire's private life. He simply wanted to understand how someone with such remarkable ability had chosen a path so different from what the world might expect. When the restaurant owner accepted the call, his voice immediately warmed at the mention of Claire's name. "She has surprised us from the day she arrived," he said with quiet admiration. "Most people notice her languages first. That is only a small part of who she is." Daniel listened carefully. The owner continued. "Claire had nearly completed graduate studies in linguistics before her father became seriously ill. She returned home without hesitation to help her family. After he passed away, she stayed because her mother still needed support. She never described it as a sacrifice. She simply believed family came before personal ambition." Daniel stood silently beside the office window overlooking the city. "She never mentioned any of that," he said quietly. "She almost never does," the owner replied. "Every evening after work she studies. Every Saturday morning she volunteers at a neighborhood cultural center, helping new immigrants practice English while encouraging local students to appreciate other languages. She says people stop fearing each other when they begin understanding each other's words." After the call ended, Daniel remained standing with the telephone still resting in his hand. Around him, the executive floor buzzed with meetings, schedules, and ambitious conversations. Yet his thoughts remained fixed on one woman wearing a simple waitress uniform. She had never tried to impress him. She had never spoken about her education, her personal challenges, or the opportunities she had postponed. Everything Daniel admired about her had been discovered naturally through patience rather than performance. Late that evening, he returned to Lucille without business partners, without reservations for international guests, and without any formal agenda. Claire greeted him with the same warm professionalism she offered everyone who entered through the front doors. Nothing about her manner suggested she expected recognition after the previous evening. She simply smiled and said, "Good evening. Welcome back." Daniel smiled in return before quietly answering, "I think this evening I came here for more than dinner." Claire met his eyes with calm curiosity. sensing that another conversation was about to begin, one that would reach far beyond languages and reveal the values that had quietly shaped both of their lives. Claire Bennett guided Daniel Harrison to a quiet table near the restaurant window where the evening lights of Manhattan shimmered across rain-polished streets. There were no international guests waiting, no executives carrying presentation folders, and no unusual expectations surrounding the evening. For the first time, the Billionaire chief executive officer had come simply to listen. Claire placed a cup of freshly brewed coffee before him before taking his dinner order with the same calm professionalism she offered every guest. Nothing about her suggested she expected gratitude for what had happened the previous evening. After the meal arrived, Daniel looked toward her thoughtfully. "May I ask you something that has been on my mind since yesterday?" Claire smiled gently. "Of course." Daniel rested his hands quietly on the table. "You could have become a professor, a consultant, or an international interpreter. Why remain here?" Claire glanced briefly around the dining room, where coworkers welcomed arriving guests with warm smiles. "Because this is where people forget to pretend," she answered softly. Daniel looked puzzled. Claire continued, "In a restaurant, families celebrate milestones. Business partners build trust. Travelers miss home. Couples remember anniversaries. Strangers become friends. I learned something about humanity every single evening." Daniel listened without interrupting. "Languages are only tools," she said. "Understanding people is the real purpose." Before Daniel could respond, his mobile phone vibrated quietly. His executive assistant spoke with unusual urgency. One of Harrison Global's largest international negotiations scheduled for the following morning had encountered an unexpected complication. The Swiss delegation had requested significant revisions after discovering several cultural misunderstandings inside the proposed partnership framework. The meeting had not been canceled, but confidence between both companies had weakened. Daniel thanked his assistant and ended the call with a thoughtful expression. Claire noticed the concern in his eyes, but never asked unnecessary questions. Daniel looked at her after a brief silence. "Tomorrow may become one of the most important meetings of this year." Claire simply nodded. "I hope it goes well." Daniel smiled faintly. "That depends on whether both sides feel understood." Claire's expression remained calm. "Sometimes people disagree because they hear different words. Sometimes they disagree because they attach different meanings to the same words." Daniel recognized the quiet wisdom immediately. The following morning, Harrison Global Headquarters welcomed the visiting delegation beneath clear spring skies. The conference room overlooked Manhattan through floor-to-ceiling windows while interpreters, legal advisors, and senior executives carefully reviewed every document before discussions resumed. At first, the meeting progressed politely, but tension slowly returned whenever subjects involving family ownership, long-term commitments, and regional business traditions appeared. Every sentence seemed technically accurate, yet something important continued slipping away between translation and understanding. During a scheduled coffee break, Daniel stepped into the hallway and remembered Claire's words from the night before. "Understanding people is the real purpose." Without hesitation, he telephoned Lucille and respectfully asked the restaurant manager whether Claire might be available for a short consultation if her schedule allowed. The manager happily agreed because the late morning restaurant service remained unusually quiet, and Claire herself accepted only after confirming her coworkers would not be burdened by her temporary absence. Less than an hour later, she arrived at Harrison Global, wearing her neatly pressed waitress uniform beneath a simple navy coat. She appeared neither intimidated nor excited by the impressive headquarters. She simply greeted everyone with quiet courtesy. After Daniel introduced her as a cultural language advisor for the discussion, Claire listened carefully before speaking. She never interrupted conversations or corrected anyone publicly. Instead, she gently explained the history behind certain expressions, the emotional significance of regional traditions, and the subtle differences between literal translation and genuine meaning. Slowly, the atmosphere inside the conference room changed. Faces relaxed. Questions became conversations instead of arguments. Smiles gradually replaced hesitation. By the conclusion of the meeting, both companies reached an agreement built not only upon favorable contracts, but also upon renewed trust. As the Swiss delegation prepared to leave, their chairman warmly shook Claire's hand. "Today you translated much more than language," he said with sincere appreciation. "You translated respect." Daniel quietly watched the exchange, realizing once again that the most extraordinary person in the room was still the woman who would return that evening to serve dinner with the same humility she had shown from the very beginning. The days following the successful partnership meeting quietly marked the beginning of a transformation that few people inside Harrison Global immediately recognized. The signed agreement attracted praise from financial analysts and industry publications, yet Daniel Harrison knew the greatest achievement had not appeared on any contract. It had happened during the moments when people stopped trying to impress one another and simply began understanding one another. That realization remained with him long after the visiting delegation returned to Switzerland. The following Monday morning, senior executives gathered inside the company's executive conference room, expecting another review of quarterly performance. Large presentation screens displayed financial projections while department leaders prepared detailed reports. Instead of beginning with numbers, Daniel stood before the room in thoughtful silence for several moments before asking a question no one expected. How many talented people have we overlooked because we judged where they worked instead of what they could contribute? The room became completely still. Several executives exchanged uncertain glances, believing there must be another point hidden behind the question. Daniel continued calmly. Last week reminded me that extraordinary ability often remains invisible because we never think to look for it. That ends today. He instructed the Human Resources Department to conduct a complete review of the company's hiring practices, promotion standards, mentorship programs, and leadership development process. He wanted every manager to identify employees whose abilities had never been fully recognized simply because their current positions failed to reflect their potential. Receptionists, administrative assistants, customer service representatives, maintenance staff, junior analysts, and warehouse coordinators would all receive equal opportunities to demonstrate their ideas. Some executives appeared surprised by the proposal, but Daniel remained confident. The next great leader inside this company may already be working here, he said quietly. Our responsibility is to notice before someone else does. Over the following weeks, Harrison Global launched a new initiative called Hidden Potential. Employees from every department were invited to submit ideas for improving communication, customer experience, efficiency, and workplace culture. Instead of filtering suggestions through layers of management, every proposal reached a review panel where titles and departments remained anonymous. The quality of the idea mattered far more than the position of the person presenting it. The response exceeded every expectation. A receptionist proposed a scheduling improvement that significantly reduced client waiting times. A warehouse supervisor suggested a more efficient shipping process that lowered transportation costs while improving delivery reliability. A customer support representative introduced a communication system that dramatically increased client satisfaction. One thoughtful contribution after another revealed abilities that had remained unnoticed for years. Daniel quietly smiled each time another unexpected voice transformed the company because he recognized the same lesson repeating itself again and again. Several evenings later, he returned to Lucille, where the familiar warmth of the dining room welcomed him once more. Claire Bennett approached his table carrying a pot of fresh coffee and smiled with her usual quiet grace. "Good evening, Daniel." He returned the smile. "Good evening, Claire. I wanted to thank you." She tilted her head slightly. "For dinner. For changing the way I lead." Claire gently poured the coffee before answering. People change themselves. Sometimes another person simply helps them notice the path. Daniel looked around the restaurant where families celebrated birthdays, travelers shared stories, and coworkers laughed together after long days. "We launched a new program this week," he said. "It encourages everyone inside Harrison Global to share ideas regardless of position." Claire's eyes reflected genuine happiness. "How did your employees respond?" "Better than anyone imagined. Some of our strongest ideas came from people who had never spoken during executive meetings." Claire nodded softly. "That does not surprise me." Daniel smiled. "It surprises me that it surprised me." Claire laughed quietly before looking toward another table where a young server appeared nervous while carrying several dinner plates. Without hesitation, she walked over, offered a few calm words of encouragement, and helped rearrange the plates before the guests noticed any difficulty. She returned a moment later as though nothing unusual had happened. Daniel had watched every second. "You do that naturally," he observed. Claire looked slightly confused. Do what? You notice people before they ask for help. Claire considered the question for a moment. Most people hope someone will believe in them before they completely believe in themselves. A little encouragement often arrives exactly when it is needed. Daniel remained thoughtful as she returned to her work. Watching her move quietly through the restaurant, treating every guest and every co-worker with equal respect, he understood that leadership was not created inside boardrooms alone. Sometimes it was practiced every evening by someone carrying a serving tray with patience, humility, and the rare ability to see extraordinary potential hidden inside ordinary lives. Several months passed, and the Hidden Potential Initiative quietly reshaped the culture of Harrison Global in ways no one had predicted. Employees who had once remained invisible now confidently presented ideas during leadership forums. Departments that had rarely collaborated began sharing solutions across the company. Business magazines praised the organization's innovation, but Daniel Harrison understood that the greatest achievement could never be measured by headlines or quarterly reports. It lived inside people who had finally begun believing that their voices mattered. One bright autumn morning, the company hosted its first Emerging Voices Summit inside the headquarters auditorium overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Instead of inviting only senior executives to speak, Daniel insisted that employees from every level of the organization should stand on the stage. Receptionists, analysts, maintenance supervisors, customer service representatives, and interns all prepared presentations describing improvements they had introduced through the Hidden Potential program. Before the event began, Daniel quietly walked through the auditorium greeting each participant personally. He noticed nervous smiles, trembling hands, and hopeful expressions that reminded him of his own first presentation many years earlier. Remember, he told them warmly, today is not about proving your worth. It is about sharing what has always been there. The words eased many anxious faces. As the presentations unfolded, one remarkable idea followed another. A young receptionist described a welcoming system that had significantly improved the experience of international visitors. A warehouse coordinator demonstrated an inventory process that reduced unnecessary waste. A customer support specialist explained how simple changes in communication had strengthened client relationships across several countries. Every speaker received genuine applause, and every success reminded Daniel how many opportunities had remained hidden simply because no one had asked the right people the right questions. That evening, after the summit concluded, Daniel returned once again to Lucille. The restaurant looked exactly as it had on the night they first met. Candlelight reflected across polished glasses. Gentle piano music floated through the dining room. Claire Bennett greeted guests with the same calm smile and quiet confidence that had never changed despite everything that had happened. When she reached Daniel's table, she noticed something different. The thoughtful seriousness he once carried had softened into quiet contentment. You look happy, she observed while pouring fresh, sparkling water. Daniel smiled. Today I watched people discover confidence they did not know they possessed. Claire nodded gently. Sometimes people only need permission to believe what has always been true. Daniel looked around the dining room before lowering his voice slightly. The summit reminded me of our first conversation here. Claire laughed softly. The evening everyone was afraid to serve you. Daniel smiled with genuine humility. Perhaps they were not afraid of serving me. Perhaps they were afraid of being judged before they were understood. Claire considered those words thoughtfully. That happens in many places, not only restaurants. A young waiter carrying dessert plates accidentally hesitated beside a nearby table after forgetting part of an order. Before embarrassment could appear, Claire quietly stepped beside him, gently reminded him of the correct dessert, and encouraged him with a reassuring smile. The guests never noticed the small mistake, and the young waiter returned a grateful smile before continuing his work with renewed confidence. Daniel watched the interaction carefully. You did not correct him, he said after she returned. You protected his confidence. Claire rested her hands lightly against the back of an empty chair. People learn more easily when they feel safe. Daniel remained silent for a long moment. That simple sentence explained far more than leadership seminars, management books, or executive workshops ever had. He suddenly understood why Claire inspired trust wherever she went. She never led through authority. She led by creating an environment where other people could become their best selves. Before leaving the restaurant that evening, Daniel paused near the entrance and looked back across the softly illuminated dining room. Claire was helping an elderly couple choose their dinner, while another young server listened carefully beside her, learning not only the menu, but also the quiet art of making every guest feel valued. Daniel smiled to himself as he stepped into the cool autumn air. Harrison Global had changed because one extraordinary waitress never tried to become extraordinary. She simply chose every day to notice the dignity inside ordinary people, and that quiet choice continued spreading farther than either of them had ever imagined. Winter arrived quietly over Manhattan, covering rooftops with a thin layer of fresh snow while warm lights glowed behind office windows across the city. Nearly a year had passed since the evening Daniel Harrison first sat at table 12 inside Lucille, believing he understood how to recognize excellence. Now Harrison Global had become known for something far more meaningful than financial success. Universities praised its scholarship initiatives. International partners admired its culture of respect. Employees spoke proudly about working for a company that listened before judging. Yet the person who had inspired so much change still spent several evenings each week serving guests with the same quiet grace. One snowy evening, Daniel returned to Lucille after finishing a long board meeting. The familiar sound of soft piano music welcomed him as Claire Bennett greeted him with her gentle smile. "Good evening, Daniel," she said. "It has been a busy week." Daniel laughed quietly. "You always seem to know." Claire poured warm tea before answering. "People carry their days in the way they walk." Daniel smiled because he had learned never to underestimate observations that sounded simple. After dinner, he reached into a leather portfolio and carefully placed a single envelope on the table. Claire looked at it curiously before opening it. Inside rested a formal invitation from Harrison Global offering her the newly created position of Director of Cultural Communication and Leadership Development. The role would oversee international mentoring, language education, scholarship partnerships, and leadership training across every global office. Claire slowly finished reading before looking up. "This is an extraordinary opportunity," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "It belongs to the person who quietly changed this company without ever trying to." Claire remained silent for several thoughtful moments. Snow drifted gently beyond the restaurant windows while guests continued enjoying peaceful conversations around them. Finally, she folded the letter carefully and asked one calm question. "If I accept, what happens after I am gone?" Daniel looked surprised, but answered honestly. "The programs continue." Claire held his gaze. "That answer matters more than the title." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Explain that to me." Claire smiled gently. "Too many organizations depend on one remarkable person instead of building remarkable values. If people only succeed because I remain here, then I have not truly helped anyone. I want the culture to survive long after every individual changes." Daniel slowly nodded as her words settled into thoughtful silence. "It will," he replied. "The board unanimously approved permanent funding for every mentorship program, every scholarship, and every cultural initiative. They are no longer temporary projects. They are now part of who Harrison Global chooses to become." A quiet warmth appeared in Claire's eyes. "Then I would be honored to help." Daniel smiled with genuine relief before Claire raised one finger with a playful expression. "On one condition." Daniel laughed softly. "I thought there might be one." Claire glanced around the dining room where a young waitress carefully greeted arriving guests while an older server quietly encouraged her. "I would like to continue working here one evening every week." Daniel looked genuinely curious. "Most people would leave immediately." Claire shook her head. "This restaurant reminds me why everything else matters. Here I meet grandparents celebrating anniversaries, students beginning new journeys, business partners learning to trust each other, families gathering after long separations, and strangers discovering kindness from someone they have never met before. If I stop seeing ordinary life, I might eventually forget who I am serving." Daniel smiled with unmistakable respect. "Then Harrison Global will gladly work around your schedule." Claire laughed softly. "That is the easiest negotiation you have completed all year." They both smiled as warm candlelight reflected across the polished table. Outside, the snowfall grew heavier, covering the city in peaceful silence. Inside the restaurant, nothing appeared extraordinary to the surrounding guests. They simply saw a billionaire quietly sharing tea with a waitress after dinner. No one realized that the conversation taking place beside the window would influence thousands of future employees, students, and families. As Daniel prepared to leave, he paused beside the entrance and looked back one more time. Claire had already returned to welcoming new guests with the same patience and humility she had shown from the very first evening. Her title had not changed the way she treated people because her purpose had never depended upon titles. Watching her quietly serve another table, Daniel understood that true leadership was never about standing above others. It was about remaining close enough to never forget the dignity waiting inside every ordinary conversation. Spring returned to Manhattan exactly 1 year after the evening that had quietly changed 2 lives forever. Cherry blossoms framed the walkways outside Harrison Global headquarters while hundreds of guests gathered for the company's first annual Bridges of Opportunity celebration. Students, educators, employees, community leaders, and families filled the spacious courtyard with conversations spoken in many different languages. Colorful banners displayed scholarship projects, mentorship, success stories, and cultural exchange programs that had grown from a single belief that every person deserved to be seen before being judged. Daniel Harrison stood near the entrance instead of waiting on the stage. He greeted every guest with the same warmth regardless of profession or title. Young scholarship recipients shook his hand with grateful smiles. Maintenance workers proudly introduced their families. Receptionists who had once doubted their own potential now led workshops for newly hired employees. Every face represented another reminder that remarkable ability had always existed. Someone simply needed to notice it. Across the courtyard, Claire Bennett welcomed visiting students beside an exhibit celebrating languages from around the world. Although she now advised Harrison Global on communication and leadership, she still worked 1 evening each week at Lucille and continued volunteering every Saturday at the neighborhood cultural center. Her responsibilities had expanded, but her heart remained rooted in the ordinary conversations that first taught her how deeply people long to be understood. As the ceremony began, several scholarship recipients stepped onto the stage to share their journeys. One young woman described becoming the first college graduate in her family after receiving language education support. Another student explained how a mentorship opportunity helped him discover confidence that years of self-doubt had hidden. A customer service representative spoke about presenting an idea through the hidden potential initiative that eventually improved communication across the entire company. Applause filled the courtyard again and again, yet every story pointed toward the same quiet truth. Lives changed because someone chose to listen. Near the end of the celebration, Daniel approached the podium carrying only a single sheet of paper. After looking across the audience for several thoughtful seconds, he gently folded the paper and placed it aside. "A year ago," he began, "I believed excellence could always be recognized by experience, titles, or achievements. Then I met someone who reminded me that wisdom often arrives wearing an apron, instead of an expensive suit. The greatest lesson I learned was not about language, business, or leadership. It was about respect. When we begin seeing people for who they truly are instead of where they stand today, extraordinary possibilities begin appearing everywhere." The audience responded with warm applause, but Daniel looked only toward Claire. She stood quietly among the students rather than beside company executives, smiling with the same gentle humility she had shown from the beginning. She neither sought recognition nor stepped away from it. She simply encouraged a nervous scholarship recipient preparing to speak next. After the ceremony, families gathered beneath blooming trees while children laughed and chased drifting flower petals across the lawn. Daniel slowly walked beside Claire through the peaceful garden paths. For a while, neither of them spoke. The comfortable silence reflected months of trust built through ordinary conversations. Finally, Daniel smiled. "Do you remember the first thing you ever said to me?" Claire laughed softly. "I remember hoping you would enjoy dinner." Daniel shook his head. "You gave me something much greater than dinner." Claire looked toward the students celebrating nearby. "What was that?" Daniel watched a young employee confidently mentoring a new intern before answering. "You taught me that the strongest companies are built the same way the strongest friendships are built. Someone listens first." Claire smiled warmly as spring sunlight filtered gently through the blossoms above them. People rarely forget the ones who truly listen. Together, they continued walking through the celebration, while conversations in many languages blended into one peaceful chorus of hope, gratitude, and possibility. Around them, no one noticed the quiet beginning that had made this day possible. They simply enjoyed the opportunities now growing in every direction. Yet hidden beneath every scholarship, every mentorship, every act of encouragement, and every life forever changed remained the same simple lesson that first appeared across a restaurant table on an ordinary evening. The world does not become better because extraordinary people demand attention. It becomes better because ordinary people choose to recognize extraordinary worth in one another before anyone else does.